Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. What does the rise of the Yellow Vest movement in France tell us about the state of the neoliberal order in Europe? Are the protests in France the largest since 1968, just about a hike in fuel prices? And is Emmanuel Macron the right person to be president to address the problems so many have in France? Cross-talking France's Yellow Vest, I'm joined by my guest, Bruno Dewesky in Paris. He's a political analyst and a professor of National Institute of Languages and Eastern Civilizations. In Brussels, we have Luc Rivet. He's an independent journalist. And in Luxembourg, we cross to Louis Chauvel. He is a professor at the University of Luxembourg. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate. Bruno, let me go to you first and address the first question I asked in my introduction. We all know, anyone's watching this program, the catalyst for these protests and this protest movement was an increase in fuel prices. But I think that the larger picture is that this is a protest against neoliberal policies that working people, not just in France, but all across Europe have had to deal with. I mean, this is the politics of austerity under the cover of dealing with global warming. The people are not so stupid to fall for that. Go ahead, Bruno.
Yes, of course. The miscontent is began very long ago, but it was the last moment. I mean, it's a mixture of fuel prices with miscontent because of the arrogance of Macron. But, of course, basically, it's against neoliberal policies that were carried on by Macron, Hollande earlier, and Sarkozy, and even earlier. So it's a general, insurrection against it, and that's why the concession the government did 2 days ago are just they have no sense, because people want much more. They want a change in basic policies.
Okay, let me go to Luc in Brussels. There, you were nodding your head. I mean, I thought the government's response was quite interesting, but it plays to a certain strategy they have. First, they say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Listen to us. We're your leaders. Number two, oh, you must be these populist, which of course is a code word for neo-fascism. And then number three, they make a minor concession, but they don't want to have a discussion about it. I mean, every step of the way shows failure of leadership here, okay? And you haven't fooled these people, because they understand that they have the real power. And why in the world should poor people have to pay for austerity? Austerity is making people poor. Go ahead, Luc.
Well, it's the last straw for these people. You know, they are the working French, the people who never complain and pay their taxes.
Yep.
But look at the number of people on the roundabouts and look at who is there. Many women, single mothers with kids. They cannot feed their kids after the 20th of the month because they only earn 1,300 euro per month and they spend 300 in fuel. But there is more than just the fuel. Huh? There is also the gas prices that were supposed to go up for heating, and also electricity prices have gone up 500% over the last 5 years in France. So this is terrible, everything at the same time, and the price of the motorways and. And what strikes me, as you say, is that in terms of communication, this team of Edouard Philippe and of President Macron is incredibly bad. Incredible. 3 weeks to come to that result saying, okay, yeah, you have won, we'll suppress the tax. Incredible.
Well, but they haven't won. That's the wrinkle in all of this here. They've just postponed their decision. They have a lot more austerity planned. It's very, very clear what Macron wants to do. Okay, Louis, let me go to you in Luxembourg. I mean, how would you characterize this? A lot of people that say this is class struggle. I've mentioned that it is putting neoliberalism on trial. What is it for you? Because the French have a tradition of street protests. It's a very rich tradition in France. But what is the difference, let's say, between 2018 and 1968? Go ahead, Louis.
Indeed, if you want first, before interpretation in terms of politics, we have to describe the sociological reality. The sociological reality today is that in France you have a large middle class, lower middle class, that was very stable, almost privileged, and with stability of labor status, etc., 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 in the 1970s, 1980s, and it had been the result of the economic progression of the post-World War French situation. The middle class, the lower middle class today in the street, today in France, are the kids of the generations that have benefited from the economic boom of the so-called Trente Glorieuses, the 30 years after the Second World War. Now you have a backlash. You have a systematic backlash. You can say it's neoliberalism. You can say many, many different things. But simply the reality is that in the past, you have kids of poor who became rich. Yeah. Now you have a situation where the kids of the rich, of the okay, stable, relatively affluent middle class of the 1970s is now facing a backlash, economically speaking. The situation with Macron now is even worse, simply because there had been an economic bump, let's say, a kind of temporary recovery over the last 3 years, with many hopes of improvement. And the problem of Macron is that many people hoped from Macron a kind of new golden area. Now Macron is facing a backlash, and he's facing a kind of aggregation of convergence and even more synchronization of frustrations, because he had been hosted like a kind of new de Gaulle 2 years ago, and now he's facing a
new de Gaulle. Okay.
That's
a real stretch, a new de Gaulle. Okay, I was trained as a historian. He is no de Gaulle. Okay, let me go to Bruno. Let me go back to Bruno here. I mean, Macron. I mean, I watched the presidential campaign with great interest, because I thought it was fascinating how the elites could invent this guy from virtually nowhere, sell him. The media backed him very, very much. They used the usual scare tactics with Madame Le Pen, and now we have their president, the elite's president, that is completely out of touch with the voters. And he's got a long way to go through his term in office. Yes, so Bruno, go ahead.
Yes, of course, the casting for Macron was technically very good, but in fact,
casting, perfect.
You know, he destroyed all.
Perfect word, casting.
Yes, it's a casting. It was a pure casting. And, you know, just that they forgot that the real people voted for him, some of them at least, because he had not a strong majority, but at least he has a majority. They voted for him because they wanted the end of the traditional parties from the right or left who were who developed that neoliberal policies. And he was supposed to be a new man with a new, ideology, but in fact, he was chosen by the elite to accelerate the neoliberal policies. So it couldn't work. I mean, it worked for the first 2 months, and then it finished. And people discovered they have somebody they call now on the street. It's a new king. It's not even a new king. It's a new Marie Antoinette who completely ignores the real country.
Let them eat cake. Yes, indeed. Luke, reflect upon that, because, I mean, he did come in making a lot of promises, but his promises weren't to the people, they were to the elites. So we see this creeping privatization of medicine, for example. And Louis was absolutely right. I mean, even into the 1980s, France had a lot to boast about its health care of its population. That is no longer the case today. Go ahead, Luke.
True, the king is naked, and you mentioned, or somebody mentioned earlier, the fact that in the first few months it was okay, while he immediately introduced the ISF. It was one of the missions for which he had been selected, you know, to introduce the suppression of the tax on fortune, or the change of it, only to on buildings, on the ownership of buildings. But the main bulk of the tax has been suppressed. France was one of the few countries to have this tax, if not the only one. It has suppressed it, but now the people, of course, the poor, when you ask them to pay much higher prices for their fuel, they make a comparison with last year, the ISF, the suppression of the tax on fortunes. So they cannot swallow it. It's you know, at the same time, he loves to say that, you know, it's always at the same time. He gave money back to the rich and he took it from the poor. That doesn't work, you know. Somebody should tell that young man that this is not the way forward.
Okay, Louis, let me go back to you here. I mean, there's been a lot of defections from Macron's government. I mean, is his government under threat right now? I mean, a lot of people apparently don't want to work with him.
Typically, you have a strong destabilization. At some point, I remember that regarding Obama, Vladimir Putin said something like, the deepest disappointments come from excessive hopes.
Yes.
There had been excessive hopes on the side of Macron, and now we face the backlash. The situation, the problem is that Macron still have 3 years and a half theoretically to wait for the next elections, and it will be very difficult on these recent trends to find the energy to go to this target. The most important thing to underline now is that in France we are facing a relatively strong economic deceleration. Yes. In the sense that 2 years ago the economic conjuncture was much better. Now you have an economic slowdown, and people are relatively frightened of the consequences of that. We are already relatively strict or limited on cash at the state level in France, and which will be the result of a new recession.
Okay, Louis, I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a hard break, and after our break, we'll continue our discussion on the yellow vests. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing yellow vests. Okay, let me go back to Bruno in Paris. Okay, we've discussed this simmering revolt against the neoliberal order. One could even say elements of the architecture of the European Union. We can get to that later. But Bruno, one of the things I think is really quite fascinating is this. It was, and I'm convinced, I believe it, it was a spontaneous movement that came together. And I think the yellow vest metaphor is so brilliant because it's asking for help, okay? You don't want to be run over because people feel like they're being run over. Now, but the interesting thing is here is that the trade unions didn't step up, the political parties didn't step up. It just took this last element, this, you know, this element of putting pressure, austerity on people for them to finally come together and find solidarity. Depending on how it goes, this is a fascinating phenomenon because the European Union in its neoliberal order doesn't like surprises. Everything is planned out to the last detail. This is not supposed to happen. Go ahead, Bruno.
Yeah, you're entirely right, you know, because the success of European Union was to create the European Confederation of Trade Unions and what they call the European parties. And this structure, financed by Brussels, corrupted every parties and trade unions and parties from the right and left. So they destroyed any potential opposition, real opposition to neoliberalism. And now there is something something they couldn't plan that is happening. And what is very interesting is that now you have 80% of the French people who are against the government and its neoliberal policies. But what is even more interesting is the fact that it's not the traditional, let's say, opposition classes which are on the forefront of the fight. They support it, but they don't do more. What is very interesting is now in the arena are coming people from the peripheral France. I mean, the province, little towns, countryside, very young people, old people, people who never were active, and that was that part of France who is in fact joining the anti-neoliberal course, and that's very interesting. And I don't really imagine how the leading groups and classes will manage that for the next 3 years.
Yeah, well, the elites just apparently don't know or really don't care how everybody else lives here. Luc, President Macron said there is no such thing as French culture, saying that nationalism is wrong. I mean, what kind of French president is this? Something that wants to emulate de Gaulle. De Gaulle, for better or worse, embodied the greatest traditions of France and of its entire history, I would say. So what kind of president of France says there's no French culture? I'm absolutely aghast by that comment. But it seems to me his way of rule is exactly that, okay? He doesn't care about France. Go ahead, Luc.
True. He'd like to be Jupiter, style of the Gaul, but he's not the Gaul. He doesn't have the respect of the people. And he has sort of left away the intermediate bodies, les corps intermédiaires. So there is nobody under him. He is there with Edouard Philippe's government, and they are on top of the Olymp, and they look at the French. So he had it vertical, completely vertical. There is nobody in between. The trade unions, as you said, are left behind. They are nowhere to be seen. He has sort of won against them with the railroads, the SNCF. But in this instance now, it is really a rebellion of the poor whites, just like for Donald Trump. You mentioned the populists earlier. Well, this is the same sort of phenomenon, you know?
Okay, Louis, where does it go here? Because historically speaking, when there is a spontaneous protest or uprising, the key to success is sustainability. Now, a lot of people have come out, put on their yellow vest, and they've made a statement, okay? But where does it go from here? Historically, a movement, a large movement that is not organized relatively quickly tends to fade away because people have had their burst of protest, but if it is not channeled somehow, my understanding is that these people, the protesters, are not interested in the political parties. They're not interested in the trade unions stepping forward. They don't trust any politicians right now. It's a very interesting mix right now. So my question is, where does it go from here? Go ahead, Louis in Luxembourg.
Indeed, the situation in France is very different to 1968 mobilization. In these old good times, 30% of wage earners had their trade union membership, and the political parties were very, very strong at the end of de Gaulle and in the 10 years, 15 years after de Gaulle. Nowadays, you have a kind of desertification of politics. You have a situation where trade unions are less than 5% of wage earners. And political parties are extremely weak, and even weaker with Macron, who has been able to kill Socialist Party, and the center right wing is relatively weakened now with internal conflicts. So the situation today, technically speaking in sociology, we call that anomie. Anomie is a problem not only of governance, of decision. Anomie is the fact that people have lost strong structures they had before. And in this anomic situation, you have problems of, you have said, sustainability. Sometimes you have a new movement that developed pop-ups from nothing. The Yellow Vest movement was unexisting almost 2 months ago. And now you have a situation where they are obviously massively present in the place. What is sustainable is not the yellow vest movement. The sustainable thing is that you have a new French spirit of, let's say, destabilization, strong frustration, sense of anxiety regarding future. And in this respect, the situation is even more revolutionary than a simple anti-liberal policy situation. You have a situation where people don't really know where it's possible to go. The situation today at this time in the current period is that the diesel tax had been excluded from the, it had been expelled from the framework.
What's really, let me jump in here. Let me jump in here. I think what's really fascinating, Bruno, is that right now, and of course you're much closer to the ground than I am, there is not a whole lot of organization. They're still articulating their demands on a much more macro scale. Of course, there's the energy prices, but you know this is leading to other things. But juxtaposition on the other side, you have a government that is paralyzed in how to react. Every step of the way, it has stumbled. And it does, at least to me, it doesn't look like the government has a learning curve to be able to interact with people to address these grievances. So you have a very strange dynamic going on right now, a government that seems paralyzed, and I was going to say a social movement. I don't even know if it's a social movement yet. This is where we're at, right? Go ahead, Bruno.
Yes, of course. Now there are no real strong organization. Maybe the Yellow Vest will organize because you have some, public assembly, local public assembly, and out of that, maybe something will happen. I don't know. We will observe, and it will be very important what happens next Saturday with manifestation in Paris. What will happen? Of course, within the leading forces, we have two tendencies, I suppose. Some of them are obviously talking now about a state of emergency, which means repressions, and others are, tending to talk about, elections, taking into account that anyway in 6 months there will be European elections. So anyway, we have a situation where it's very difficult to know what will happen. But what is important is that all official institution and people at the occupying place in the hierarchy are delegitimized. And, people don't believe anymore in the official values, in the official institutions, and in the neoliberal policies. So I don't know what it will change in the near future. But anyway, the French society will never be back to what it was 1 month ago.
Yeah, let me go to Luke, because they prove their power in numbers, okay? Yeah, I tell you, this whole Euro project is terrified of democracy. People's will, that is like, it is. It's like a plague to them, okay? They need to go back up in their little towers and lock all their gates, okay? Luke, is there a demonstration effect for the rest of Europe watching what's going on in France?
I think it is. You've seen that Belgium, Holland, even Serbia, Germany, you have yellow vests appearing. Maybe it's not a revolution like it is in France, but it is going elsewhere as well. And you said their lack of organization is true. They are not organized, but it is their strength, because the power in place in Paris cannot deal with them. They can't talk to people without having others saying, we deny them the authority to speak for us. So it is a strength. Just like in 1789 at the French Revolution, the people were crying for bread. Now they cry for fuel, but it's only a beginning. And as you said, the liberal order is going to change profoundly. In Brussels, you cannot just simply say there are the progressives and then there are the nationalists. This doesn't work anymore, And the Commission can start. Yesterday, they announced that they would go for the fake news, like those, of course, of RT and others who are the bad guys. But nobody believes them.
I'm
anymore.
used
There
to
is a real trend for populism left and right.
We're almost, I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm going to end on this. I am so pleased that maybe finally we can start reinventing our political language, because what the mainstream media tries to do is buttonhole us, divide us. Something new is happening, and it's exciting. Let's keep our eyes open. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in Paris, Brussels, and in Luxembourg. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.